afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Lauren Swartz, the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia, and it is my pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us and giving your time to us. For over 70 years, the Council has brought our community fresh, nonpartisan civil discourse on critical issues that affect the world. And of course, you know that today's program is no different. We'll take a look at the ever-evolving impacts that military airstrikes have on civilians around the world and what can be done to stay informed on this important issue. I'd like to offer a special welcome to all of our members and guests who are joining us today, including the students and teachers of all ages who participate in the Council's education programs throughout the year. We work with over 2,500 youth across 85 schools annually to be the leading provider of foreign affairs and international youth education across this region. These students are not just the future leaders, but they're also leading today, trying to solve the issues confronting the world and their futures. If you'd like to send us questions during the conversation today, please do so using the questions function on Zoom, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And in the spirit of training the next generation of global leaders, we will kick off our first question later in the program from a junior at Temple University here in Philadelphia, Jimmy Fee. Jimmy spends his time as a Global Smarts mentor, preparing middle school students preparing to compete in the Council's Junior Model United Nations, where over 600 kids compete to solve the problems of the world facing their futures. Following Jimmy's questions, we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. And now I'd like to introduce our guest for today. Chris Woods is the founder and director of Airwars, where he leads on research, investigations, and military advocacy. Chris is a conflict specialist who worked for the BBC's Newsnight and Panorama as a senior producer for many years. Now, Chris also set up and ran the Bureau of Investigative Journalism's award-winning Drones Project. His book, Sudden Justice, charts the history of armed drone use in Iraq and elsewhere since 9/11. Chris, welcome, and thank you for being with us today. The virtual microphone is yours to make a few minutes of opening remarks, and then we'll turn to our discussion, followed by audience question and answer. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you so much for having me today. Hopefully you can hear me. We've been having microphone problems today as well. So thank you so much, everybody, for making the time this lunchtime. It's a pleasure to be here virtually. I've several times I've had the delight of visiting with World Affairs Council chapters across the USA for physical events, which feels like a lifetime ago now. But I've always had such a warm welcome when I've visited with the World Affairs Council chapters, and also such exceptional questions. So I'm setting the bar quite high for everyone. For later on. So very, very briefly, I guess the question we get asked most of all here at Airwars is why we were set up, and I thought I'd just deal with that at the outset, and it really sort of touches on some of the themes that we'll talk to today. Those with longer memories will recall back in 2011 when NATO intervened in Libya. We just seen the 10th anniversary of that intervention. When NATO got to the end of that war, it made a rather remarkable public claim, which was that despite many hundreds of airstrikes across Libya, which had initially begun as a way of protecting civilians, and in the end had contributed to the ousting and death, in fact, of Muammar Gaddafi, the long-term dictator of Libya, that no civilians had died as a result of NATO's actions. This was a remarkable claim by NATO. It also wasn't true. Libyans themselves had reported from the ground very well documented cases where Libyan airstrikes by NATO had unfortunately harmed civilians. Not in large numbers, but certainly several hundred civilians it did look like had been killed by NATO. In that same year, 2011, John Brennan, who was at that time President Obama's chief counterterrorism advisor, and who went on to lead the CIA, made a similar statement where he claimed that CIA counterterrorism strikes in Pakistan were now so precise and so well researched and driven by intelligence that the CIA was no longer killing civilians in these strikes, that they were only harming the bad guys. So this was the evolving narrative at the beginning of the last decade. But as a journalist, someone who was sent by the BBC, by others, into the field to report on conflicts, what we were hearing on the ground from civilians was very different. So when in 2014 the war against so-called Islamic State came along, and this was obviously a major war, initially just involving the United States, but very quickly drew in 14 other countries who fought alongside the US in both Iraq and Syria. Airwars was founded by myself and a French data journalist with the premise of, given that we expected militaries to make some fairly bold claims about civilian harm, would it be possible to track what communities were experiencing themselves in real time or close to real time, using newly emerging social media and digital media to really understand from the perspective of affected communities what was happening to them, and then to try and come up with some baseline estimates of civilian harm. During the 2003 to 2011 occupation of Iraq, estimates that nobody knew how many civilians had been killed by our intervention, by the US and British intervention. Estimates ran as high as 1 million, as low as 10,000, and nobody knew where on the scale those numbers were. But with the war against ISIS, we thought, well, would it be possible to do this? And so that is really what Airwars has been doing over the last 7 years. We've evolved over time. We now study many more conflicts. We study 6 conflict nations, dozens of individual belligerents, from Russia to local Libyan actors, terrorist groups, and of course, actions by the US and its allies as well. And in that time, we've tracked almost 60,000 reported civilian deaths. So according to those communities affected by conflict, the high-end estimate is as many as 60,000 civilians have been killed. We think the actual number is likely significantly lower, based on a methodology we've evolved and refined that doesn't change according to whichever belligerent that we're looking at. So we can use the same approach, the same methodology to look at how Russia behaves against how the United States behaves, or how a local actor in Libya is acting compared to an international actor. And we can draw from that some findings. So when we began Airwars, I'd always assumed we'd be an outsider organization. I had assumed that we would do our work and we would be ignored by militaries. That turned out not to be the case. And that was really down to President Obama. In 2014, you'll recall, the Obama administration began to change its approach to civilian harm. It had become a very damaging critique that the Obama administration was indifferent to civilian harm. And so some changes were introduced by President Obama. First of all, the threshold at which strikes could be taken was changed, so that there had to be an expectation of almost 0 civilian deaths. And this immediately changed the number of civilians being killed on the battlefield. And then in mid-2016, by now Airwars have been up and running for a while, the Obama administration, President Obama himself, introduced an executive order which committed the US military to a new approach on protecting civilians, which was one of mitigation. The relationship between the US military in particular and NGOs has generally been an adversarial one, partly because NGOs themselves tend to focus on the most egregious cases, the ones which likely breach the laws of war. What the Obama administration said was, okay, if we assume that most of the strikes we're conducting are lawful, but we're nevertheless killing a lot of civilians, how can we reduce the number of civilians that we kill? And Airwars because of its own focus on mitigation, found itself in a fairly serendipitous place. And the administration and indeed military commands like CENTCOM were prepared to work with Airwars on our findings. They disagreed hugely with us on our numbers, but they also respected our methodology and how we were gathering those numbers. And to give you an idea of where we are today, last year in the war against so-called Islamic State, of the deaths that the US-led coalition officially conceded for Iraq and Syria, 60% of those casualty events were referred to the coalition by Airwars. So in a strange way, the US military has become our biggest client at Airwars. It uses our data more than anyone else and has admitted more civilian harm than any other military that we work with. So what we had assumed would have been an outsider role turned into something much more nuanced and interesting. And just to sort of finish up my opening comments, I think the challenge for us today, having secured some positive breakthroughs and changes with the US military, is how to make those long-term, how to systematize them, how to ingrain into the way that the US and its allies fight wars the protection of civilians, not as a peripheral issue, but as a central issue, because the one thing it turns out we're all in agreement on is that everybody wants to reduce the number of civilians killed and injured in war. And that is something that we and the Pentagon are in 100% agreement on. But how do you lock that in? How do you achieve that as a long-term goal? So if I park there, Lauren, if that helps us to set up who we are, and over to you.
It certainly does, Chris. Thank you. Already a lot to think about. I've got more questions written down. We do have I'm going to take a little bit of a turn. We have a question from the audience that I think would be helpful to frame out the discussion. Andy asks, what does the speaker mean or assume by saying the so-called Islamic State? Can you help us define your perspective on what that encompasses and what it doesn't?
Yeah, so we use the term so-called Islamic State because the vast majority of Muslims absolutely reject the idea that Islamic State itself made that it could represent the Islamic world. So if we simply called them the Islamic State, that might imply that we accept that terrorist group's perspective that they represent the entirety of Islam. So Muslims themselves, and the majority of my staff and volunteers are Muslim, absolutely reject that construct. And so we talk about so-called Islamic State. It's a way really of saying that is their claim, but we don't recognize that their claim to represent the entirety of Islam, which of course they don't. They're a terrorist organization with very extreme views that the great majority of Muslims, of course, reject.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful, Chris. All right, so you've given us a perspective on, sort of how your organization got started and when Airwars really took off in terms of impact and some of the challenges. Let's talk a little bit about the actual technology to help frame the stage and what we really mean here. Today people are familiar with drones as toys for their kids or even pizza delivery vehicles. And so drones have this, in some cases, really positive association in our minds. But of course, the technology we're here to talk about is much more complex and deadly. So can you help our audience better understand what the specific types of weapons are being used in military airstrikes and how they might affect local communities differently? What do we need to understand technically to understand the issue better?
So when we're talking about drones, as you say, this is primarily not the stuff that we play with in the backyard. These are big military drones that were initially developed by the Israelis and as unarmed surveillance platforms. The American military started using them around about the mid-1990s. But in early 2001, we just passed the 20th anniversary of the first successful drone strike of any kind, which was conducted by the US military and the CIA back in January 2001, so before 9/11. The CIA worked out a way that you could weaponize these big drones, put missiles underneath them, underneath their wings, and conduct targeted precision strikes. The point about a drone is they used to be called unmanned. It's not that they're unmanned or uncrewed. There are crews, but those crews, because of the way the drones operate, which is via satellite, remote satellite, are thousands of miles away in safety in places like Creech in California and 100 other places these days around the world. So you can observe the battlefield in real time, remotely, and then you can act in real time. That was the huge change with armed drones, because the way war used to be was that you would identify with a satellite or even an unarmed drone a target. Let's say you found Osama bin Laden, but by the time you got a B-52 in or a F-15, it's hours later and the target is long gone. What drones did was what they call shorten the kill chain, so that instead of now being hours between identifying and acting, we're now talking about minutes or sometimes even seconds. And that has been the revolution that armed drones have brought to the battlefield, along with the lowering of risk to the belligerent, because your pilots are no longer in harm's way. If you lose a drone, okay, it's $20 million lost, but it's not the 200 million of a manned fighter or bomber, and of course the risk to the personnel. So there's a big argument that armed drones lower the threshold for war because belligerents are more likely to use armed drones than crewed aircraft, and that pushes us into warlike situations more often. Francis Fukuyama, you might remember, in the 90s, made that extraordinary claim that we'd reached the end of history. This was, and then of course 9/11 happened, and he never talked about that again. He is a very good historian and analyst, and he's just published an essay saying that the impact of armed drones was the equivalent of the dreadnought being developed by the Germans and the British in the early 20th century. An absolutely staggering game changer. And that is certainly what armed drones have been. They have proved incredibly useful. What they've meant in terms of some communities and some theaters is that there used to be no-go places on the battlefield, places you couldn't get to, places that groups could hide, including terrorist groups. So after the 9/11 atrocities, Al-Qaeda retreated to the very remote foothills and mountains of Pakistan, where historically they'd never been targetable. But armed drones changed that, and suddenly they could loiter 24/7, they could track Al-Qaeda, they could hunt them down, and drones became critical in the effective destruction of Al-Qaeda. By the early 2010s, Al-Qaeda Central had pretty much disappeared, and armed drones have been a key part of that. So they made every place on earth accessible to military violence, but that also brought risk and peril and stresses to communities who might previously have been immune to the violence of war. Suddenly all corners of the planet were vulnerable to conflict. So that is certainly the downside of armed drone use.
A lot more and more tentacles to this discussion, tying it back to what's happening in middle America, where somebody's just typing on a computer and initiating these drone strikes, and what would have happened to Al-Qaeda if we didn't have drones. Let's keep going and cover a few more things, and then we'll turn to audience questions. I know there are many. So when we think about UAVs in comparison to conventional airstrikes, you talked a lot about this in your 2015 book titled Sudden Justice, America's Secret Drone Wars. In that book, you provided a comprehensive look at the misunderstood world of drone warfare, the impacts on civilians, and them being touted as so precise, right, that civilians are no longer in harm's way, as you said in your opening remarks. Can you talk to us a bit more about how over the last 2 decades, since September 11th, 2001, the way that war and conflict has changed. You talked a little bit about that. No geography is safe, but maybe some of the tactics or alliances that we used to rely on. How has the whole war's theater changed as a result of this technology?
I think it's slightly episodic at the moment. So we, as well as the drone revolution, we also had conventional wars, boots on the ground. Many American troops lost their lives in Iraq and Afghanistan. These weren't remote wars; these were troops on the ground wars, and thousands of American servicemen and women paid the ultimate price. And so, I think we have to be careful thinking that war has just become entirely remote. Where it has changed is that drones are sort of part of an arsenal, and we have the option of remote wars these days. So, for example, the war against Islamic State was primarily fought from the air, but there was still, at any one time, up to 10,000 US troops on the ground in Iraq and Syria, also fighting, supporting Iraqi and Syrian allies in the ground fight against ISIS and so on. So it's, I guess, a more of a hybrid warfare type. But I guess the big change as well, my book published in 2015, so it's a few years old now, and it's not a bad history of armed drone use up until that point. But of course, the way these things are, I have to now write a completely new book about, I've called this the second drone age that we're in. And what we're in now is a completely different period of drone warfare where we've seen proliferation of armed drone use. So dozens and dozens and dozens of countries now have armed drones, and they use them aggressively. So last year alone, we saw armed drones tilting wars in both Libya and Nagorno-Karabakh, that very brutal short war between Azerbaijan and Armenia over a territory that had been held by Armenia for several decades. With Turkish armed drone support, Azerbaijan was able to recapture that entire territory in just a few weeks because of the use of armed drones. So armed drones by many more actors now, but also non-state actors, terrorists and militant groups have also now got access to armed drones. That big shift in warfare happened around about 2016 when ISIS and Al-Qaeda began weaponizing shop-bought drones. They worked out how to put mortar shells and other munitions on drones and use them to devastating effect against ground forces. So we're now in an age of proliferation where we can't really control how drones are used anymore. It used to be pretty much a closed club. America and Israel made armed drones. The British were allowed to use American armed drones, and that was the club. It was just those three countries. Today, pretty much anyone, if the US won't sell you armed drones, you can go to China and buy China's armed drones. If China won't sell you the drones, you can buy them from Turkey. If you're a terrorist group, you can go to Walmart and buy an off-the-shelf drone, and then you can weaponize it. So it's a completely different world now, and potentially a far more insecure and risky world where drones are concerned. I'm trying not to sound too dark and depressing here, but I'm trying to find some positives here. But it's definitely a sort of evolving scenario with the use of armed drones.
Indeed, ever evolving. And I'd like to ask an ancillary question to this. With drones starting in Israel and the United States, with the opportunity for the Brits to use them, it was a club, right, as you said, and that perhaps affected our reputations around the world. Three countries that have very serious, big reputational stakes. And as the United States' reputation has changed specifically, say over the past 4 or 5 years here with very different foreign policy shifts, response to COVID, there's a lot of discussion about the end of liberalism, what countries are being looked up to or admired or seen as in charge of the global order and things like this. So can you talk to us a little bit about the reputation impact of drone warfare and maybe what that transition was, thinking of it starting from Israel, US, and Britain, sort of having the best weapons and these things that are very controversial. But now it's been, I don't know if democratized is the right word, but they've become more accessible on the black market and through typical channels. So does the reputational hit that maybe occurred for the three leading countries at first, has that dissipated because these are more ubiquitous?
It's a good question. I think the issue with armed drones is always how you choose to use them. So, for example, the British have only ever used their armed drones on the conventional battlefield as just another weapon system. And they would argue, and they have argued, they've said this many times, that they feel that actually having armed drones helps them to minimize, for example, civilian harm, because they can take the time over a shot, they can track a suspect, they can find the right moment of intervention when there are no civilians around to take the shot, and so on. And also, armed drones generally use much smaller munitions. That began as a practical issue because armed drones couldn't carry so much weight, but actually turned out to be quite helpful, because the smaller your munition, the less risk of damage to those around your strike point. So, you know, the average size bomb used by the US military in the war against ISIS was still the 500-pound bomb, whereas the average drone munition is generally 100 pounds. So it's 1/5 of the size. So there can be benefits to civilians. So it's never been so much about the platform itself, but how you use the platform. And of course, the great controversy about the American campaign was using it for targeted assassinations, many of them conducted not by the US military, but by the CIA in countries where the US wasn't at war. And you had no accountability, no transparency, the CIA claiming it wasn't killing civilians, but of course it was. And this damaged over time the US's reputation. And I think that was what Obama tried to address back in 2014 when he changed the rules, and we saw the civilian deaths start to fall. And one of the most surprising phone calls I've ever received. So for years, I tracked CIA campaigns in places like Pakistan and Somalia, and was regularly and publicly attacked by US defense officials for making claims around civilian harm. In 2016, I got a call from the White House saying, we're going to admit more than 100 civilian deaths from those strikes. And that was a very positive thing. It was one of the last things that Obama did, the last 6 months of the Obama presidency, and they decided to concede more than 100 civilian deaths over several years in those controversial campaigns. And that was a very positive thing. They didn't tell us which countries the civilians died in or which events. You know, we're still trying to get that information 5 years on, but that was a positive step. A recognition that no weapon system is perfect. Civilians are always at risk in war, and they're always going to be killed and injured. You can change the metrics, but you can't actually get those numbers down unless you start admitting the casualties and understanding how, where, and when you're killing people. And of course, that's been the big focus of air wars on these much bigger conflicts using a range of weapons, which is what air wars these days is focused on.
Right. So taking the global theme and countries' relationships a bit further, let's move over to talk a little bit about what's going on in Africa. An international coalition led by the United States in partnership with local forces has worked since 2014 to dispel the Islamic State from Iraq and Syria, as we talked about. And while that Islamic State's caliphate fell a little over 2 years ago, they continue to operate, as we know, in countries, in both of those countries and beyond. In fact, just last week, the New York Times released a report about the Islamic State's new regional branches in places like Mozambique and elsewhere around Africa. In these countries, ISIS is engaging local militants as an attempt to project strength and inspire supporters worldwide. This does not bode well for local communities in these countries, of course, and for those countries that would wish to take down ISIS. The war is moving and they must move with it. Do you foresee a shift among the international coalition to continue to track ISIS militants using airstrikes like we're talking about on the continent of Africa? And what will this mean for civilians on the ground there? Will it look different in some way?
It's a really great question. So the war against ISIS, we've only seen that move outside the theater of Iraq and Syria once, which was when ISIS took control of a major city in Libya in 2016 called Sirte. And the US conducted 500 airstrikes on that city over a 6-month period in Libya, and eventually successfully drove ISIS out of Sirte. Sirte is, I think, Libya's 3rd or 4th largest city, so it's a very significant capture by ISIS, and the US took that very seriously. Other than that, there have been some strikes against ISIS in Yemen, some strikes against ISIS in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, and in Somalia. But I guess this raises this really fundamental question now, which President Biden's announcement yesterday of the withdrawal from Afghanistan in September, the 20th anniversary of 9/11, really raises. Is the US going to take this opportunity to sort of end the forever wars? And the forever wars does include the wars against ISIS, the wars against Al-Qaeda. You know, when Al-Qaeda Central was destroyed in Pakistan, it dispersed and appeared elsewhere. That kind of approach, the counterterrorism approach, has been described as whack-a-mole, as mowing the grass. You know, we're still conducting the same campaign in Yemen today that we were 20 years ago, in Somalia 14 years ago. The campaign in Pakistan has now ended, but that's because Al-Qaeda Central's gone, and also because the Taliban doesn't need to hide in Pakistan anymore because it occupies so much of Afghanistan today. So could the coalition take on ISIS in Mozambique, in Somalia, in Yemen? Yes. Is that what's going to happen? That's a very interesting question at the moment. And my guess is we are going to see a fundamental shift in, it won't just be Afghanistan that we're going to see the fighting end. In Somalia, for example, there hasn't been a declared US action in Somalia since Donald Trump's last day in office, January 19th. 0 strikes. We've tracked nothing in Yemen, nothing in Pakistan, nothing in Libya. Everything's stopped right now. And whether that means the Biden administration is pausing and reassessing and reevaluating, or these wars are over, we don't really know. We also don't know what that means in terms of resurgence of terrorism and regional actors like ISIS. Will they use that to drive forward? There are already worrying signs in Somalia, for example, where Al-Shabaab, which is the main threat in Somalia, is now resurgent. The US military has effectively been acting as Somalia's air force for the last few years. And now that all the American strikes have stopped, it does seem that Al-Shabaab is getting bolder. It overran several Somali military bases last week, killed a lot of Somali soldiers. Previous to that, the US would have intervened and would have conducted airstrikes to defend those Somali soldiers. It didn't happen. And so we're in a period of flux, I suspect. So while it could happen, it's really not clear with the administration at the moment what will happen and whether we're going to see a retrenchment from many of these wars, which of course is what many people want and have been demanding for years. So it's not without significant support.
All eyes will be watching, certainly. And so let's carry on with the theme of Libya, Somalia, and Yemen, which often do get overshadowed by the headlines in the conflict and war-torn places like Iraq and Syria, that at least in this country are more often in the news. And these countries are facing multiple crises too. Libya, you know, with the decades of chaos following the assassination of Gaddafi, as we've mentioned, Somalia with Al-Shabaab and the US troop drawdown. Yemen, of course, is fractured into multiple groups and has escalated intervention from Saudi Arabia. These countries have experienced so many military interventions from outside forces through airstrikes and drone use and other impacts as well. And when we think about the civilians, the impact is hard to even begin to comprehend, from airstrikes and all of the other impacts and interventions from actors, terrorists, you know, militant groups and beyond. I know this isn't your area of focus, but I can't help but ask, what can be done for civilians in these war-torn nations? Are they just stuck waiting for another drone strike, or are there paths forward that we can explore?
I think the most important thing we can do is to give civilians agency and recognize the immense suffering that civilians still suffer in every war. And particularly, actually, recent wars, which have tended to move quite heavily into cities, we've seen devastating civilian death tolls in individual cities across Iraq, across Syria, across Libya, across a dozen other countries where civilians have died in their thousands as a result of warfare. And we can't keep treating the deaths of civilians in conflict as inevitable. There's a great US-based not-for-profit called the Center for Civilians in Conflict, CIVIC, and they just put out a really bold strategic plan. They work with militaries on the ground and strategically to get civilian deaths down, and we work alongside them a lot. And you know, their top line is civilian deaths in war aren't inevitable. We don't have to tolerate this. We don't have to accept this. We can ask for things to be done differently. If we prioritize civilian lives at the beginning, if we fight our wars differently, if we don't fight our wars until we have to, you know, too often it feels that we reach for war sooner rather than later, you know, without thinking through the consequences, partly because we don't bear the consequences. You know, these countries get absolutely devastated by our interventions. And yes, you know, we help to defeat, you know, terrible enemies like ISIS, but the cost is staggering sometimes. You know, the city of Mosul, which was Iraq's second city, a city of legend, you know, 70% of its historic heart was destroyed by us and ISIS and the Iraq government in the fighting. Probably around 12,000 civilians died in the fight for Mosul, killed by all parties. We may never know how many died at Mosul because so many of the dead are still under the rubble and have never been recovered. So, you know, how do we do things differently? We accept that civilian death happens and we can change those metrics. We can make choices that reduce the number of deaths and injuries, even if by achieving the same effect. Of course, we want to win the wars we're part of, but you know, how we win them matters. It really does.
I'll pull in a follow-up question from Margaret in our audience. She asks, do modern airstrikes cause health problems for the civilians who survive?
There's a good question. So there was a big problem about 20 years ago with munitions that use something called depleted uranium. And there were a lot of studies suggesting, although some argue it was never conclusive, that it vaporized when the weapons were dropped, and there were indisputably higher levels, for example, of fetal abnormalities in communities that have been heavily bombed with these weapons, although, you know, militaries have argued about how causal the connection was. Those weapons, they're not really used anymore. But yeah, of course, the effects of these weapons are devastating. Airwars is part of a global campaign against, it's got the acronym AWIPA, Explosive Weapons in Populated Areas, and it gets virtually no traction in the United States. It's a very important campaign, spearheaded by Ireland, the government of Ireland. It's got the backing of dozens and dozens of countries now, looking at a political commitment by states to limit the use of explosive weapons in urban environments. So Margaret's question is, you know, how does it affect? So, for example, we know that if you drop a bomb in an urban area, children are much, much more likely to be killed and injured and to suffer long-term debilitating effects than adults. So if you think about it, of course, that makes sense, because the blast wave on a young body is going to do so much more damage than on a mature body. So we know children are abnormally affected by the violence that we visit. We know that the chances of a child surviving an airstrike or an artillery strike are so much lower than an adult being saved from that same event. So psychological effects of war, physical effects, you know, people losing limbs, long-term disability, trauma. I can't imagine the trauma that communities go through being under bombardment and sometimes saturation bombing. So the effects can cascade, you know, and last long beyond the point that a munition was dropped on a particular building or neighborhood.
A heavy load, right? And lots of questions. I'll pull over to a question from Kristen that builds on this. What can average citizens do to encourage our legislators to focus on these issues around transparency with military airstrikes, perhaps taking some of the comments you've made of being more cautious about leaning towards war quickly and being accountable for some of the damage that's done?
Another great question. So we've actually, you know, the US is involved in a lot of conflicts, but actually right now, the US is way ahead of almost all of its allies in tackling the scourge of civilian harm. It is proactively looking at this question with the backing, the bipartisan support of Congress to do better. And so some of the reforms that were introduced by President Obama sustained, interestingly, during President Trump. We kept working with the Pentagon, with CENTCOM, with AFRICOM during Trump's presidency, and we're now engaging again with Joe Biden's team. So there is a willingness by the US military to look at this to do better. I think part of that is because there was a whole cadre of commanders, people like Petraeus, McChrystal, Mattis, who'd been through Iraq and had been through Afghanistan and seen the terrible effects that high civilian casualties in those communities had on the war effort. And so there was a sensitivity there. So please don't assume that, you know, writing to the Pentagon, writing to your congresswoman, you know, writing to your senator doesn't make a difference. It actually does. We know there's support for this in the Senate, in the House. We know that many people are concerned about this, and it cuts across party, and as it should. This isn't a left-right issue. This is something we should all care about. Nobody wants to see high civilian casualties as a result of our actions. So, you know, there's lots that you can do. I never underestimate the value of a personal letter to your representative, telling them why this matters to you, and they listen. And they, you know, there are many congressmen and congresswomen, senators out there very engaged on this, and we hope more will become as time goes on. And feel free to write to the Defense Secretary as well and tell him to do better. I think it does matter. I think it can make a difference.
A simple, time-tested solution or opportunity to a very complex technical challenge. Keeping on the thought of influencing policymakers and, of course, our changing of the guard here in the United States, we know President Biden ordered a review of the U.S. policy of drone usage and counterterrorism efforts and asked for this temporary halt in military airstrike operations in non-war zones. If you could have a conversation with President Biden and his administration, what would you say to him about this review process? What do you hope might come out of it?
I think, I mean, if I ever had that privilege, I think, you know, our advice at Airwars would be bold. The US really can lead the way here. You know, I mentioned earlier that the US has admitted more than 1,000 civilian deaths in the war against ISIS. Here in Europe, we're terrible at this. But, you know, so my country, the UK, where I'm based, my country has admitted 1 death in the war against ISIS in almost 7 years of war. France, which has conducted more air and artillery strikes than any other country in the war other than the United States, has never admitted to harming a single civilian in the war in almost 7 years of fighting. This is a terrible record. And the US, we really feel, can lead by example. And we do feel you can, if you reach the point of crisis where you have to fight, you can still do that in a way that that protects civilians as best you possibly can, because that will mean that the recovery and healing process afterwards is so much easier. The more civilians you kill and injure, the more destruction you wreak, the harder it's going to be to put everything back together again afterwards. It's strategically in our advantage to limit the harm to civilians in war. And it distinguishes us from our enemies or our frenemies. Russia openly targets civilian populations. It goes after hospitals. It goes after marketplaces. It targets civilian neighborhoods. Because for Russia, that's how they fight their wars. And the US can and should distinguish itself from belligerents like that and say, actually, no, you don't, that's not the way to fight war. That's not how this is done. And so if those were the words I got to say, that's what I'd say. Yeah. I think he's got a few other things on his plate at the moment as well. So yeah.
He does seem to have quite a few priorities. All right, let's move on to our audience questions portion of our program. We've got Jimmy Fee, who's a junior at Temple University, very interested in world affairs, maybe can help us solve some of these problems as he works through his career. And he also mentors middle school students who are participating in our junior Model UN competition in May. Jimmy, what's your question for Chris today?
Good afternoon, Chris. Thank you for speaking with us today. With my work with the council, I got to actually do some of the preparation for this event, looking into some of the technical issues like cluster munitions and drones. And one of the things I came across that you kind of touched on a little in the beginning was a Brown University's paper from the Washington Institute that discussed the relationship between a military's rules of engagement and civilian casualties, they call us. And I wanted to ask if you guys have noticed the same trends, which you did touch on a little bit, and specifically what changes militaries can make to the rules of engagements to mitigate civilian casualties, and if you've had conversations with these militaries about that very thing.
Yeah, it is a great question, Jimmy, and it's probably the most challenging one, because when wars are fought, it's always a balance between the risks you're prepared to take to win the war, the speed you want to defeat your enemy, where the risk is going to be at any one point. To give you an example, during the Battle of Mosul, in East Mosul, which was the less populated part of Mosul, mostly Islamic State, so-called Islamic State, was cleared from East Mosul by ground fighting by Iraqi special forces. They suffered 50% casualties, Iraqi special forces. The elite of the Iraq military lost 50% to death and injury because they were fighting pretty much hand-to-hand, house-to-house. That was a devastating cost. And so the decision was taken to rely much more heavily on airstrikes and artillery strikes to preserve Iraqi forces. And that led to an immediate jump in the number of civilians being killed. So there was a transfer of risk from the warfighting machine onto the civilian population. But I've had very, detailed conversations with coalition, with Iraqi commanders who say, we had to do that to win the battle. We couldn't take those losses and we had to beat them. So these are very difficult choices that militaries make and have to make. And where the risk lies for civilian population can change quite significantly, even within a short period of time. But all of that said, we still think it's possible that, choices of what weapon you use, when you strike, how you strike, these are important choices that can very significantly change the number of civilians killed and injured. When we looked at the Battle of Mosul, we found that the biggest determinants of civilian harm were not whether you were using precision bombs or adhering to IHL, both of which we welcome, they are good things, but the density of population, how many civilians were packed into a neighborhood and how heavily you were bombing that neighborhood. These are This has been true in war for centuries. It's as true today as it was 500 years ago. You know, the heavier you bomb an area and the more civilians in that area, the more civilians you're going to kill. So some of those metrics, you've just got to grapple with those and do things differently. But you know, it's a terrible thing, but the Geneva Conventions do not forbid the killing of civilians. They offer us ways to limit and moderate the death of civilians, but they don't forbid us to kill civilians. And this is something that all militaries are aware of, sadly. Yeah, not the happiest of answers, but yeah, great question.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jimmy. We've got a question from Andy that might have a positive glimmer or a positive spin. We'll see. Andy asks, he's asking about determining the number of civilians who have been or are being killed in recent wars. Can you determine how many civilians were killed by drones versus by means other than drones? Is there a way of determining if drones save lives when used for the specific purpose of killing a non-civilian? Can you parse this data and somehow make it better that drones are used in certain circumstances?
So theoretically, to answer Andy's question, drones could help to limit the number of civilian deaths because of what I was talking about earlier about their ability to loiter, to stay on target, to track, to choose the moment of intervention, to use very precise strikes, and also to choose exactly that moment of intervention. And also there's some fairly radical munitions have been developed. The CIA has begun recently using a variant of the Hellfire missile. It's not the nicest thing to hear this, but it doesn't have explosives in it. It's full of basically knives, and when the missile hits a vehicle, the knives fly out and shred everything in the vehicle, but it doesn't blow up, it doesn't kill everybody around. So it's a very, very, you know, there's some pretty grim technological advances going on out there to limit civilian harm, but also to achieve the effect that you want. So that's on the plus side. Having said that, there's a very, very good drone expert, Larry Lewis, who has worked with the Pentagon over many years, conducted many classified studies. And Larry published a study a few years ago now looking at the use of armed drones in Afghanistan. And he found that civilians were more likely to be killed in drone strikes than conventional airstrikes in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, because Larry's study was for the Pentagon, he was only allowed to release the executive summary, and we've never been, even today, we're still not allowed to see the data on which Larry's findings were based. So, and we don't understand still why that was the case. Was it because of the way drone operators were disconnected from the battlefield? Was it how they were fighting? Was there something about the munitions being used or the points at which they were being used? So you would think that armed drones could save lives, but that evidence, which was a policy paper for the Pentagon, suggests that there are maybe other answers there as well. But I'd want to see the full data, and unfortunately, every time we ask, they say no. So, yeah.
Casey in our audience has a question that builds on data transparency. She asks, why do they not release the information on where the civilian casualties are located?
Well, I've some good news on that, actually. So we've been working with the US-led coalition for many years now, and they've admitted almost 400 civilian harm events since 2014, working with Airwars. And one of the challenges we had as an organization is we would sometimes find it very difficult to work out, even where they'd admitted killing and injuring civilians, which event they were talking about, because they would only give us the date of the event and the nearest large population center. But we may have, so let's say it was during the Battle of Raqqa, we might have on that one day 20 different events in Raqqa in our database, and the event they had just admitted to might not even be in our database. So we worked with the coalition civilian casualty cell to sort of improve understanding. And over the last few years, we had a real breakthrough where we convinced the US-led coalition to give us the precise locational data for every civilian harm event they admitted, down to around 100 meters. They've never given this kind of data before. If you go onto the Airwars website and look in the conflict section under the US-led coalition, you'll find a section called Credibles, and it maps all of these events there. This was a huge breakthrough. No military has ever done this before, and we very much welcome it. So generally, they've not given that kind of information, but in recent years, we've had this very big breakthrough, which we're now calling for the US military, just to make standard in all future conflicts, that of course they should say exactly where and when and how these civilians are dying, because otherwise the local population, they don't even know whether their loved ones were or weren't harmed in a particular event, and they can't pursue restitution, compensation, reconciliation. So we were very, very pleased to see them releasing that data. There's a very good, I can send through a link to the Washington Post did a very good report on our data that really sort of captured why it was such a big breakthrough.
On that slightly more positive note, we will conclude our program today. Chris, of course, there's so much more that we could learn from you. So I encourage our audience to visit the Airwars website and to perhaps pick up Chris's book, which I'm sure you can find at your local bookstore, to learn more about this. We deeply appreciate the time and your perspectives that you shared with us tonight. This is a difficult issue to discuss, undoubtedly, but often the most difficult issues are the ones that demand the most attention, and certainly more than an hour conversation, but this is a good next step. This is the work of your organization that you do all day, every day at Airwars, and that is in your book, Sudden Justice, America's Secret Drone Wars. Thank you for your leadership to ensure that the data about military airstrikes is clear and is accessible, particularly the impact on civilians around the world, which hopefully is becoming a little bit more transparent. And thank you to our audience, including our members of the World Affairs Council and new friends, for joining us today. We encourage you to check out our other upcoming programs listed on our website. Next week, we're talking about innovation leaders who are making green energy solutions affordable and accessible to all people. And then on April 27th, we will host an event in our Beyond Our Borders series featuring Chile, where we will have a travel program learning about the opportunities to visit that place and tour the wine country and learn about their constitution that they're rewriting as well. Additional programs are coming up, including a global perspective on the future of cities, partnered with Philly Tech Week, and we will feature a global wine tasting in May. You can register online and find all of our other future programming at our website, wacphila.org, and we do hope that you'll join us. Thank you again for your time and attention this afternoon. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye-bye.